Once upon a time, Judith was no stranger to adversity. Time seemed to slow down in the remote village where she and her grandmother lived, away from the bustle of contemporary cities. The village was small, surrounded by woods and fields that whispered ancient tales. Judith, who is now a stunning young lady, was born into darkness because her mother had passed away soon after she was born, leaving her life tainted by rumors. She was not treated kindly by the villagers. She was called names by neighbors, family members, and even random people who happened to walk by, sometimes in public and other times behind her back. She's a witch. Cursed, a girl who caused her own mother's death. It made no difference how kind she was, how hard she worked, or how bright her smile remained despite everything. Their judgment was unwavering. Judith had learned to endure a long time ago. She focused on her tasks, assisting her grandmother in keeping their small home together. Her days were predictable. She would sweep the yard at dawn, fetch water from the nearby stream, and assist with meal preparation. In the afternoons, she sold pure water at the village market, calling out to potential customers with soft, steady determination. People often avoided her gaze, but a few who knew her grandmother's generosity would buy from her out of sympathy or habit. Her grandmother was her steadfast support. They had little, but they did have each other. After their meager dinners of yam, her grandmother stroked Judith's hair and whispered, "You're stronger than they know, my child. One day, the whole world will see it." Those words stayed with Judith, giving her hope in an unkind world. One scorching afternoon at the market, Judith sat under the shade of a small tree, arranging her water sachets. When a neighbor rushed over to her, she recognized him right away, Mr. Thomas, a longtime friend of her grandmother. Judith's heart stopped when she saw his expression. "Judith," he said, his voice low but firm, "your grandmother has passed away." At first, the words did not make any sense. She stared at him blankly, attempting to comprehend what he had said. "Has someone passed away?" Her hands slipped and the water sachets fell to the ground. She was unable to breathe. Without saying anything else, she stood up, her legs stiff as if they no longer belonged to her. The neighbor called after her, but she did not stop. The market, which was once alive with chatter and bargaining, has become a blur. Judith walked home, her steps uneven and slow, tears streaming down her cheeks as if her body could not help but let them fall. The thoughts all came at once. How could she possibly leave me? What am I going to do now? How am I going to survive? She imagined her grandmother's empty seat, and the silence that would fill the house. And her chest ached so badly it felt like it would burst. When she reached their home's small yard, she noticed people gathered. Mourners sat in groups, some whispering while others remained silent. No one noticed Judith as she walked past them. No one inquired about her well-being or offered comfort. She seemed to be invisible. She sat on the small bench by the side of the house, crying. The days following the funeral blurred into one another. In her own home, Judith moved as quietly as a shadow. The burial was relatively small. Her relatives had arrived not out of love, but out of obligation. They murmured among themselves, their sharp words cutting into Judith as if she were not present to hear them. "It is no surprise," one stated. "That girl has been cursed. Take a look at how many deaths she causes." Judith tried to disregard them. She swept, cooked, and cleaned the house as she always did. But something felt different now. Each chore brought back memories of her grandmother's absence. The silence in the house was stronger than any sound. When the world outside fell silent at night, Judith sobbed softly into her pillow, releasing the grief she was carrying in her heart. Her relatives had no concern for her well-being. None of them offered her a place to stay or even a friendly word. They simply left after the funeral, leaving Judith alone in the deteriorating house. The villagers looked at her with the same disdain they always had, as if her suffering confirmed their cruel suspicions about her. But Judith refused to let them witness her breakdown. A few weeks after the funeral, Judith was sitting outside, staring at the empty road, when her phone rang. She took some time to respond. Her teacher's voice came through on the other end, soft and patient. "Judith, I have got good news. Your week results have been released, and you did exceptionally well. I am extremely proud of you." Judith was speechless for a moment. Her heart pounded as she clutched the phone tightly. She had worked so hard, studying late into the night by candlelight, hoping that education would one day provide her with an escape from her life's difficulties. She had finally succeeded. "Thank you, sir," she said softly, her voice cracking. After the call, Judith sat quietly, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She wanted to let everyone know how happy she was. She wanted to rush inside and tell her grandmother, hear her laugh, and say, "I knew you would do it, my child." But there was nobody to tell. Judith's hands trembled as she sobbed, her head resting on her knees. She cried not only for her grandmother, but also for herself alone in a world that had only brought her pain. Judith awoke with an unusual sense of calm the morning after her breakdown. The news of her senior secondary school results lingered in her mind, bringing a glimmer of hope. Her teacher's words rang through her ears. "You did extremely well." For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that, just maybe, she could make a life outside of the village. Her grandmother had always told her that the key to strength was endurance. She now realized that moving forward required strength as well. Judith spent the following few days contemplating her future. She did not have the money to continue her education, but she was determined. She called her teacher again, using the remaining phone credit. He was kind and encouraging, listening to her difficulties without passing judgment. "Judith," he said gently, "you have made it this far. There are scholarships and programs available for students like yourself. I will assist you. Never give up." His words sparked something inside her. She started to make plans, no matter how small. She worked harder at the market than ever before, saving every penny she made. Her relatives continued to mock her whenever they crossed paths, but Judith did not care anymore. Each insult only fueled her determination. Days turned into weeks, and Judith found herself moving quietly and purposefully. She still missed her grandmother terribly, but the loss served as motivation rather than a source of sadness. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned orange, Judith walked to the small graveyard where her grandmother was buried. She kneeled beside the grave, clutching a crumpled copy of her senior secondary school results in her hands. "Grandma," she whispered softly, "I did great. I am going to keep going. I promise to make you proud." The wind blew softly through the trees, rustling the grass around her as if her grandmother was responding. Judith stood up after wiping the tears from her face. The road ahead of her was uncertain, but she was prepared to travel it. As the first stars appeared in the evening sky, Judith turned back toward home, her steps steady and her heart full of quiet optimism. The sun had already set by the time Judith returned from the market, carrying the remnants of her sachets of water. Her legs were aching, and her back felt stiff from a long day under the scorching sun. The quietness of the house only deepened her loneliness. Without her grandmother's comforting presence, the silence was deafening, and her small house felt emptier than ever. Judith sat on the bench outside, gazing up at the stars as she often did, searching for the strength to keep going. She was lost in thought when her phone rang, jolting her out of her reverie. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" she said cautiously. "Judith, it's me, your Aunt Gloria," came the voice from the other end. Judith's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't spoken to her aunt in years. Gloria, her late mother's younger sister, lived in Lagos, a place Judith had only heard about in passing. "Good evening, Ma," Judith replied, unsure of what to expect. "I've been thinking about you," her aunt began, her tone warm but firm. "I don't like the idea of you staying alone in that village. You're just a young girl, and it's not safe. First thing tomorrow morning, I'll send you money. Go to the park and take a bus to Lagos. You'll stay with me. Don't worry, I'll take care of you and sponsor you through school." Judith's mouth fell open in shock. "Really, Auntie?" she stammered, unable to believe what she was hearing. "Yes, my dear. Pack your things and be ready. You shouldn't be alone." Judith's heart swelled with happiness. Tears of relief welled in her eyes as she whispered, "Thank you, Ma. Thank you so much." After the call ended, Judith couldn't contain her excitement. She jumped to her feet and twirled around the room, laughing and clapping her hands. It felt like a miracle. Her aunt's promise filled her with hope, and for the first time in weeks, the future didn't seem so bleak. "God has remembered me," she said to herself, smiling through her tears. The next morning, just as promised, Judith received a huge sum of money from her aunt. She could hardly believe it when she saw the alert on her phone. It was more money than she had ever held in her life. With trembling hands, she packed her few belongings into a small bag and said a silent goodbye to her grandmother's grave before heading to the park. The journey to Lagos was long and tiring, but Judith was too excited to care. She stared out the window, watching the scenery change from vast, open fields to bustling towns and highways. As the bus approached Lagos, Judith's eyes widened at the sight of the tall buildings and endless traffic. The city was alive with movement and noise, so unlike her quiet village. She pressed her face to the window, marveling at the skyscrapers. How long did it take them to build these tall buildings? She whispered to herself, awestruck. When the bus pulled into the park, Judith spotted her aunt waiting for her. Gloria was a plump, well-dressed woman with a warm smile that immediately put Judith at ease. They embraced tightly, and for the first time in a long while, Judith felt a sense of belonging. "You've grown into such a beautiful young woman," Gloria said, looking her over with approval. "Come, let's go home." Judith followed her aunt to a sleek car parked nearby, her excitement bubbling over as they drove through the city. Everywhere she looked, there was something new to marvel at. The billboards, the flashing lights, the sheer number of people going about their business. When they arrived at her aunt's home, Judith was stunned. The mansion loomed before her, its grand gates opening to reveal a sprawling compound with a neatly trimmed lawn and a driveway, big enough for several cars. She could hardly believe she was going to live here. Her aunt led her inside, and Judith's eyes darted around, taking in the luxurious furniture, the sparkling chandelier, and the sheer size of the living room. She had never seen anything like it. "Come, let me show you to your room," Gloria said, gesturing for Judith to follow. They climbed a wide staircase and entered a large, brightly lit room. Two girls were sitting on one of the beds, chatting and laughing. "Judith, meet your cousins," Gloria said. "This is Flora, who is your age mate. And this is my youngest daughter, Alora. You'll be sharing this room with them." Judith smiled nervously as the girls looked her over. Flora, tall and slim with a confident air, offered a small nod of acknowledgement, while Alora, younger and livelier, gave Judith a curious smile. "Hello," Judith said softly, clutching the strap of her bag. "Welcome," Flora replied shortly before returning to whatever she had been doing on her phone. After a brief introduction, Judith's aunt left to attend to other things, and Judith was left with her cousins. She placed her bag in a corner and looked around the room, still trying to absorb her new reality. The room was spacious, with two beds neatly dressed in matching pink covers, a large wardrobe and a vanity table. It felt like something out of a dream. Judith decided to freshen up after the long journey. She stepped into the adjoining bathroom and gasped. The bathroom was nearly the size of her grandmother's entire house. The white tiles gleamed, and there was a large bathtub as well as a separate shower. Look at how big this bathroom is," she whispered to herself, running her hands over the polished sink. "God has finally remembered me. I won't take this for granted." After her bath, Judith returned to the room, her body exhausted but her spirit light. She lay on the mat she had found rolled up in the corner, letting the events of the day replay in her mind. She was in Lagos, living in a mansion, with a promise of school sponsorship. It felt too good to be true. Just as she was about to drift off to sleep, Flora's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Judith," Flora said, her tone flat, "you'll have to sleep on this mat for now. Alora and I don't share beds with anyone." Judith blinked, confused. "Oh, okay," she replied hesitantly. "This is your bed until Mummy gets you one," Flora added, tossing the mat toward her with little care. Judith stared at the mat for a moment before nodding. "Thank you," she said quietly, trying to hide her disappointment. She spread the mat on the floor, lay down, and stared up at the ceiling. She tried to shake off the unease that crept into her heart. It was a small thing, she told herself. After all, her aunt had already done so much for her. She had no right to complain. As Judith closed her eyes, the sounds of Lagos filtered through the window, honking cars, distant chatter, the hum of the city that never seemed to sleep. She thought about her grandmother, about the journey that had brought her here, and about the future that now seemed so full of promise. But as sleep began to take her, a strange feeling settled in her chest, a mix of hope and uncertainty. Something about Flora's coldness, the way she had tossed the mat so casually, lingered in Judith's mind. It was her first night in Lagos, and though she was grateful for the new opportunities, she couldn't shake the sense that not everything was as perfect as it seemed. And then, in the stillness of the night, she overheard whispers from Flora and Alora. She couldn't make out the words, but their hushed tones and occasional laughter made her skin prickle. Judith turned her face toward the wall, her heart sinking. The city lights cast shadows across the room, and Judith wondered if she had truly found a new beginning or if she had stepped into something she didn't yet understand. The first few weeks in Lagos were like stepping into a new world for Judith. The mansion where her aunt, Gloria, lived felt like a palace compared to the small, crumbling house she had shared with her grandmother. Judith marveled at the tall buildings, the bustling streets, and the hum of life that never seemed to stop. Gloria treated her kindly, showing her genuine warmth and care. She had enrolled Judith and Flora, her daughter, in a private university, ensuring Judith had every opportunity to succeed. At first, everything seemed perfect, but as time passed, Judith began to sense the undercurrents of tension between herself and Flora. While Gloria remained kind and supportive, Flora's resentment simmered just beneath the surface, ready to spill over whenever her mother wasn't watching. It started with little things. When Judith would use the bathroom, Flora would complain loudly about how long she was taking, even if Judith had barely been in there for 10 minutes. "Do you think you're the only one in this house?" Flora snapped one morning, banging on the bathroom door. "Hurry up! Some of us have lives, you know." Judith apologized softly and hurried out, but Flora shoved past her with a scoff, muttering something under her breath that Judith couldn't quite catch, but knew wasn't kind. Then came the remarks about Judith's clothes. Gloria had taken her shopping when she first arrived, buying her a few new outfits to prepare for university. Judith treasured them, folding and refolding them with care. But Flora would make cutting comments whenever Judith wore something new. "Nice dress," Flora said one day, her tone laced with sarcasm. "You must feel so special wearing clothes you didn't even pay for." Judith froze, her face burning with embarrassment. "Auntie bought them for me," she said quietly. Flora rolled her eyes. "Exactly. Must be nice to have everything handed to you on a silver platter." Judith bit her lip, swallowing the retort that threatened to spill out. She didn't want to cause trouble. Gloria had been nothing but good to her, and she didn't want to seem ungrateful by complaining about Flora's behavior. But Flora's resentment only grew. At home, she would find any excuse to pick on Judith. If Judith cleaned the room, Flora would point out a speck of dust she had missed. "Can't you do anything right?" Flora snapped one evening, glaring at Judith as she swept the floor. "If you're going to live here, at least learn how to keep things clean." Judith clenched her fists, fighting back tears. She had spent the entire day cleaning the room, hoping Flora might appreciate her effort, but it was never enough. Flora's cruelty wasn't limited to words. Whenever Gloria wasn't around, Flora would go out of her way to make Judith's life difficult. One night, Judith opened the wardrobe to find her neatly folded clothes crumpled into a messy pile. "What happened to my clothes?" she asked, her voice trembling. Flora, lounging on her bed with her phone, didn't even look up. "Oops. Must have slipped when I was looking for something," she said casually, her lips curling into a smirk. Judith spent the next hour refolding everything, tears streaming down her face. At university, things weren't much better. Gloria had arranged for Judith and Flora to share the same dorm room, hoping it would strengthen their bond. But Flora made it clear that she wanted nothing to do with Judith. She would ignore Judith in public, acting as though they were strangers. During group discussions, Flora would roll her eyes whenever Judith spoke, muttering to her friends and laughing as if Judith had said something foolish. "Do you always have to talk?" Flora said one day, her voice loud enough for the entire group to hear. "No one cares about your opinion." Judith felt her face flush with humiliation. She wanted to defend herself, but the words caught in her throat. Despite everything, Judith refused to let Flora's behavior break her. She reminded herself of her grandmother's words, You are stronger than they know. Whenever Flora's cruelty threatened to overwhelm her, Judith would retreat to her books, pouring her energy into her studies. Gloria noticed Judith's dedication and often praised her for it. Judith, I'm so proud of you, Gloria said one evening during dinner. You've adjusted so well, and your grades are excellent. Keep it up. Judith smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. Gloria's support meant everything to her, and she didn't want to disappoint her. Flora, however, couldn't stand the praise. She glared at Judith across the table, her fork stabbing into her food with unnecessary force. Of course she's doing well, Flora said with a fake smile. She doesn't have anything else to do but study. Must be nice not to have any friends to distract you. Gloria frowned. Flora, that's enough. Flora shrugged, but the satisfied smirk on her face told Judith that she had gotten her point across. One night, Judith returned to their dorm room to find her bed soaked. Her mattress was drenched, and her blanket lay in a soggy heap on the floor. What happened here? Judith asked, her voice shaking. Flora, sitting at her desk, didn't even look up. Oh, the water jug spilled. Guess you'll have to sleep on the floor tonight. Judith stared at her in disbelief. You could have told me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Flora shrugged. Not my problem. Judith spent the night curled up on the cold floor, her tears soaking into the pillows she had managed to salvage. Through it all, Judith kept her pain to herself. She didn't want to burden Gloria, who was already doing so much for her, but the weight of Flora's cruelty began to take its toll. There were nights when Judith lay awake, questioning her place in the house, wondering if she truly belonged. And yet, even in her darkest moments, Judith held onto her faith. She prayed for strength, for patience, and for the courage to rise above Flora's hatred. One evening, after a particularly rough day, Judith sat on the edge of her bed, clutching her grandmother's old scarf. She closed her eyes and whispered, I miss you, Grandma. I wish you were here. The next morning, Judith woke up determined to focus on the good things in her life. She had an education, a supportive aunt, and a chance to build a better future. She refused to let Flora's bitterness steal her joy. One day, while Gloria was visiting their dorm, she noticed Judith's mattress was still damp from the incident with the water. Judith, what happened here? Gloria asked, her voice filled with concern. Before Judith could respond, Flora jumped in. Oh, it's nothing, Mum. She's just clumsy and spilled water all over her bed. Judith opened her mouth to protest but stopped herself. She didn't want to cause trouble. Gloria frowned, her eyes narrowing. Judith, is that true? Judith hesitated, then nodded. Yes, Ma, she said softly. Gloria didn't look convinced. I'll buy you a new mattress, she said firmly. Flora's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Despite everything, Judith found moments of happiness. She loved learning, and her classes filled her with excitement. She made a few friends who appreciated her kindness and hard work, and their support gave her the courage to keep going. One evening, as she sat in the dorm room, preparing for an exam, Flora walked in and slammed the door behind her. You think you're so special, don't you? Flora sneered. Mom treats you like you're her daughter, but don't forget you're just a charity case. Judith looked up, her heart pounding. I'm not trying to compete with you, Flora, she said quietly. I just want to do my best. Flora scoffed. You don't belong here, she said, her voice venomous. Judith took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. I'm sorry you feel that way, she said, but I'm grateful for everything your mom has done for me. I won't take it for granted. Flora stared at her for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned and stormed out of the room. As the door slammed shut, Judith felt a strange sense of peace. She had stood her ground without letting Flora's anger consume her. That night, Judith knelt by her bed and prayed, thanking God for the opportunities she had been given. Despite Flora's cruelty, she couldn't deny that her life had changed for the better. As she lay down to sleep, a small smile played on her lips. For the first time in a long while, Judith felt hopeful. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready to face it with strength and determination. The weekend had arrived, and Judith felt an unusual sense of excitement as her aunt announced a family gathering. Gloria, ever the gracious host, had invited her wealthy friends and their children to an elaborate dinner party. Judith, nervous but curious, helped set the dining table alongside the housemaids while Flora floated around the mansion, dressed in an expensive gown and carefully applying her lipstick in every mirror she passed. Flora's excitement was obvious. "Mummy," she said, her voice dripping with anticipation, "do you think Raymond will come? You know how busy he always is." Gloria smiled. "I spoke with his mother yesterday. He promised to attend." "Don't worry, Flora." Judith didn't know who Raymond was, but from the way Flora beamed, it was clear he was someone special, or at least someone Flora thought was special. Judith, on the other hand, wore a simple blue dress her aunt had bought her. She braided her hair neatly and kept her look modest, as she had no intention of standing out in the crowd. By evening, the mansion was buzzing with activity. Cars pulled up in front of the house. An elegantly dressed guest strolled into the grand living room. Judith stayed in the background, feeling out of place among the opulent crowd. She busied herself with serving drinks, wanting to remain unnoticed. That was when he walked in. Raymond, broad-shouldered, with sharp, chiseled features and dark eyes that seemed to observe everything. His confidence was magnetic, and as he greeted Gloria with a charming smile, Flora practically skipped to his side. "Raymond," Flora said, her voice high-pitched with excitement. "You made it!" Raymond smiled politely. "Of course. How could I miss one of your mother's famous dinners?" As Flora chattered away, Judith caught herself staring. There was something about Raymond that drew her in, though she couldn't quite place it. She quickly turned away, embarrassed, and returned to the kitchen to fetch more drinks. A few minutes later, as she carried a tray of wine glasses into the living room, she felt someone watching her. Looking up, she met Raymond's gaze. He was standing alone by the window, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart race. She quickly looked away, unsure of what to make of his attention. Later that evening, as Judith stood by the dining table, Raymond approached her. "Hi," he said, his voice smooth and warm. "You must be Judith." Judith blinked, surprised. "Yes, sir." He chuckled. "No need to call me sir, just Raymond." She nodded, feeling her cheeks heat up. "Okay, Raymond. You're Flora's cousin, right?" he asked, his gaze never leaving hers. "Yes," Judith said quietly. I live with them now." Raymond smiled. "I thought so. Flora mentioned you." His tone was kind, and there was no hint of judgment in his words. "It's nice to meet you." Judith nodded, unable to find her voice. She was acutely aware of Flora watching them from across the room, her expression darkening with each passing second. As the evening wore on, Raymond found more opportunities to talk to Judith. He asked about her studies, her interests, and how she was adjusting to life in Lagos. Judith, though shy at first, found herself relaxing in his presence. He listened intently, his genuine interest making her feel seen in a way she hadn't in a long time. Flora, however, was seething. Every time she approached Raymond to steer his attention back to her, he would answer politely before turning back to Judith. By the end of the evening, Flora's forced smile had all but vanished, replaced by a stormy glare. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Raymond began showing up more often, sometimes under the pretense of visiting Gloria, but always finding a way to spend time with Judith. He would text her occasionally, asking how she was doing or sending her little jokes that made her smile. Judith was cautious. She couldn't understand why someone like Raymond, a man with wealth, looks, and charm, would be interested in her. But his kindness was undeniable. He never made her feel uncomfortable, and his steady presence became a source of comfort. One afternoon, while Judith was sitting in the garden reading a textbook, Raymond showed up unexpectedly. "You always look so peaceful when you're reading," he said, startling her. She looked. Judith felt her cheeks heat up as Raymond stood, smiling at her. "I thought I'd drop by and see how you're doing." Flora's smile faltered, but she quickly plastered it back on. "Raymond, you're too kind," she said, slipping her arm through his. "You're always looking out for everyone. That's why you're the best." Raymond gently disengaged himself from Flora's grip. "I think Judith and I should catch up," he said. "It's been a while." Flora's jaw tightened. "Actually, I was hoping you and I could talk about that charity project my mom mentioned," she said, her voice a little too sweet. "Judith wouldn't mind, right?" Judith hesitated, feeling the tension thickening in the room. But Raymond shook his head. We'll talk about that later, Flora. For now, I'd like to spend some time with Judith. Judith couldn't help but feel a small thrill as Flora's face darkened, but she quickly reminded herself not to let her guard down. Flora wouldn't let this slide. That evening, Flora confronted Judith in their shared room. What is it about you that he sees? Flora hissed, slamming the door shut behind her. You think you're better than me, don't you? Judith, sitting on her bed, looked up calmly. I've never thought that, Flora, and I didn't ask for Raymond's attention. Liar, Flora spat. You've been playing innocent, but I see right through you. You're trying to take everything from me, my family, my life, and now Raymond. Judith stood, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. I don't want to take anything from you, Flora. I just want to live my life and focus on my studies. If Raymond likes me, that's not something I can control. Flora's eyes narrowed. We'll see how long you stay in this house when Mom finds out the kind of person you really are. With that, she stormed out, leaving Judith feeling both angry and helpless. The next morning, Flora put her plan into motion. She cornered Gloria in the kitchen, her voice low but urgent. Mom, I don't know how to say this, but I'm worried about Judith. I think she's trying to manipulate Raymond. Gloria paused, looking at her daughter with a frown. Manipulate him? Flora, that's a serious accusation. I'm just being honest, Mom, Flora said, feigning concern. She's always acting so innocent, but I've seen the way she flirts with him. She's trying to trap him. Gloria shook her head. Flora, that's enough. I know you're upset about Raymond's attention, but this jealousy isn't healthy. Judith has done nothing wrong. Flora's face twisted in frustration. Why do you always take her side? She's not even your real family. Gloria's expression hardened. Judith is part of this family now, and I won't tolerate this kind of behavior from you. You need to grow up, Flora. Flora stormed out of the kitchen, her anger boiling over. Gloria sighed, rubbing her temples. She knew her daughter well enough to recognize when she was acting out of jealousy, but she hoped Flora would eventually see reason. Meanwhile, Raymond continued to make his feelings for Judith known. One evening, he surprised her with a bouquet of flowers as she walked back from class. These are for you, he said, handing them to her with a smile. I saw them and thought of you. Judith's heart fluttered as she accepted the bouquet. They're beautiful. Thank you. Raymond walked her home, and as they talked, Judith felt a warmth she hadn't experienced in a long time. He made her feel valued, seen, and protected, something she had never thought possible. But when they reached the house, Flora was waiting for them. She took one look at the flowers in Judith's hands and exploded. So this is how you spend your time, Judith? Flora sneered. Parading around with my Flora, Raymond interrupted, his voice firm. Judith isn't doing anything wrong. If you have a problem, it's with me. Flora glared at him, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. You don't see it, do you? She's using you, Raymond. That's enough, Raymond said sharply. Judith doesn't deserve this treatment, and you know it. Flora turned on her heel and stormed back inside, slamming the door behind her. Judith looked at Raymond, her eyes wide with disbelief. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't mean to cause trouble. Raymond shook his head. You don't have to apologize for anything, Judith. Flora's behavior is her own responsibility. His words gave Judith a sense of reassurance, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Flora wouldn't give up so easily. That night, Judith sat on her bed, staring at the bouquet of flowers on her nightstand. Despite everything Flora had done to make her life difficult, Judith felt a spark of hope. Raymond's kindness and Gloria's unwavering support reminded her that she wasn't alone. But as she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't help but wonder what Flora's next move would be. Whatever it was, Judith knew she would have to stay strong. The day of the family gathering arrived with an air of celebration. Gloria had invited close friends and extended family to a dinner party in honor of her latest business milestone. The house was a flurry of activity, with maids hurrying to set tables, arrange flowers, and prepare a feast fit for the occasion. Judith, as always, tried to help where she could, but Flora made sure to keep her in the background. Judith, don't touch the centerpieces. Flora snapped when she saw Judith adjusting a vase of roses. They're expensive, and you'll ruin them. Judith stepped back, biting her lip. I was just trying to help. Well, don't, Flora said sharply. Then, lowering her voice, she added, "This isn't the market, Judith. Just stay out of the way." Judith took a deep breath and walked away, reminding herself to stay calm. She didn't want to cause a scene, especially in front of Gloria, who had been nothing but kind to her. As the guests arrived, Judith kept to the sidelines, unsure of how to navigate the crowd. She wore a simple dress. Gloria had gifted her a modest but elegant outfit that made her feel out of place amidst the glittering gowns and sharp suits of the city elite. She noticed Raymond arrive, his presence commanding attention as always. He wore a tailored suit that accentuated his broad shoulders and confident demeanor. Judith tried to avoid his gaze, but it was impossible. The moment he spotted her, his face lit up with a smile. He started to make his way toward her, but Flora intercepted him, practically throwing herself into his path. "Raymond!" Flora greeted him with exaggerated enthusiasm, clutching his arm. "You look amazing tonight. Come, let me introduce you to my friends." Raymond barely glanced at her. "Maybe later," he said, his eyes fixed on Judith. "There's someone I need to talk to first." Judith's heart skipped a beat as Raymond approached her. Flora's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered, trailing after him like a shadow. "Judith," Raymond said warmly, his voice cutting through the noise of the gathering. "You look beautiful tonight." Judith blushed, feeling every pair of eyes in the room turn toward them. "Thank you," she murmured, unsure of what else to say. "Why don't we talk outside for a moment?" he suggested. Before Judith could respond, Flora stepped in. "Oh, Raymond, don't be ridiculous. Judith has nothing to say to you. She's probably overwhelmed by all this." Raymond's expression hardened. As he turned to Flora, "I think Judith can speak for herself." Judith glanced at Flora, whose face was a mask of barely concealed rage, and then back at Raymond. "It's fine," she said softly. "We can talk later." But Raymond wasn't deterred. "No, I think now is the perfect time." He turned to the room, his voice rising just enough to command attention. "I have something to say." The chatter in the room died down as everyone turned to look at him. Flora's eyes widened in horror, while Judith felt her stomach twist into knots. What was he doing? "I want everyone to know," Raymond began, his gaze fixed on Judith, "that I've found someone who inspires me. Someone who has shown me what it means to be strong, kind, and genuine." Judith's breath caught in her throat as his words washed over her. She could feel Flora's glare burning into the side of her face, but she couldn't look away from Raymond. "I've never met anyone like her," Raymond continued, "and I'm not going to hide how I feel anymore. Judith, I care about you deeply, and I want everyone here to know it." The room erupted into murmurs and gasps. Judith felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. She didn't know whether to feel flattered, embarrassed, or terrified. Flora, on the other hand, looked like she was about to explode. "Raymond," she hissed, her voice shaking with fury. "What are you doing?" Raymond ignored her. He stepped closer to Judith, his eyes never leaving hers. "You've been through so much, and yet you remain the most incredible person I've ever met. I want you to know that you're not alone anymore." Judith opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She could feel the weight of everyone's stares, the judgment, the curiosity. And then she saw Gloria step forward, her expression unreadable. "Raymond," Gloria said, her tone calm but firm. "This is a family gathering, not the place for public declarations." Raymond turned to her, his jaw set. "I understand, Aunt Gloria, but I needed to say this. Judith deserves to know how much she means to me." Gloria's gaze shifted to Judith, who felt herself shrink under the scrutiny. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Then Gloria spoke. "Judith," she said gently, "are you all right?" Judith nodded quickly, her voice finally returning. "Yes, ma'am, I'm fine." Gloria gave her a small, reassuring smile before turning back to the guests. "Please, everyone, enjoy the evening. There's no need to let this disrupt the celebration." The guests began to murmur among themselves, the spell broken. But Flora wasn't done. She stormed up to Raymond, her voice rising with every word. "You're humiliating me," she cried, "in front of everyone. How could you choose her over me?" "Flora, stop," Gloria said sharply, her tone leaving no room for argument. "This behavior is unacceptable." Flora turned to her mother, her face crumpling with emotion. "Mum, How can you take her side? She's ruining everything. Gloria sighed, her patience clearly wearing thin. Flora, no one is taking sides. But you need to control yourself. Flora looked around the room, her face red with embarrassment and rage. Then, without another word, she stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The rest of the evening passed in a blur for Judith. She couldn't stop replaying Raymond's words in her mind. The way he had looked at her, the sincerity in his voice. But she also couldn't ignore the way Flora had reacted, the venom in her words. Later that night, as she sat alone in her room, Judith heard a soft knock at the door. She opened it to find Raymond standing there, his expression apologetic. "I'm sorry if I embarrassed you," he said. "That wasn't my intention." Judith shook her head. "You didn't embarrass me. I wasn't expecting it." Raymond stepped closer, his voice soft. "I meant every word I said, Judith. You mean so much to me, and I won't let anyone hurt you." Judith felt tears well up in her eyes, but she blinked them away. "Thank you, Raymond. That means a lot." He smiled, reaching out to gently squeeze her hand. "Get some rest. I'll see you tomorrow." As he walked away, Judith closed the door and leaned against it, her heart racing. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had someone on her side. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. Flora wouldn't let this go without a fight. Judith's life at the private university had been a roller coaster of emotions. On one hand, she was thriving academically and earning the admiration of her professors. On the other, Flora's resentment was a constant shadow over her. Flora couldn't accept that Judith had managed to succeed. Despite all the obstacles, her jealousy became more apparent with each passing day, especially now that Raymond had made his feelings for Judith clear. Flora's jealousy burned brighter after Raymond's public declaration of love for Judith. The embarrassment she felt in that moment was something she couldn't easily forgive. Raymond, the man Flora secretly hoped would one day be hers, had chosen Judith instead. Her hatred for Judith deepened, and her determination to bring her down grew stronger. Judith, however, had grown used to Flora's snide remarks and cold treatment. Even though it hurt, she chose to rise above it. She kept her head down and focused on her studies, knowing that success was the best response to anyone trying to drag her down. She wasn't just studying for herself, she was honoring her late grandmother's belief in her. But Flora's schemes didn't stop. She began spreading rumors about Judith on campus, telling anyone who would listen that Judith was manipulating Raymond for his money and influence. Some of their classmates believed her, and the whispers began to follow Judith wherever she went. Raymond wasn't blind to what was happening. He confronted Flora one day after overhearing her lies. His voice was calm but firm as he said, "You think tearing her down will make me see you differently? Flora, you're only making yourself look bad." Flora crossed her arms, her eyes blazing with anger. "Why do you care so much about her? She's not even one of us. She's just enough." Raymond's voice was sharper now, cutting through her words. "I care about Judith because she's kind, honest, and hardworking. None of this petty jealousy of yours changes that." Flora stood speechless, her face red with humiliation. She realized then that nothing she could say or do would sway Raymond's feelings. But instead of backing down, her anger and jealousy grew. She decided to try a different approach. When her mother, Gloria, came to visit, Flora wasted no time trying to manipulate her. "Mom, I'm really worried about Judith," she said, feigning concern. "She's always around Raymond, and people are starting to talk. It's making our family look bad." Gloria raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "What exactly are they saying?" Flora hesitated for a moment before continuing. "That she's using him, Mom. She's taking advantage of his kindness. I just think we need to be careful." Gloria was silent for a moment, watching her daughter closely. She had raised Flora and knew when her words came from a place of truth, and when they were driven by jealousy. Instead of reacting, she decided to observe Judith herself before making any judgments. Judith, as always, treated Gloria with the utmost respect. She never asked for anything, always carried herself with humility, and stayed focused on her goals. Over time, Gloria's suspicions about Flora's motives deepened. She began to see her daughter's behavior for what it was: a desperate attempt to tarnish Judith's reputation. Judith, meanwhile, remained steadfast. She worked hard and maintained her composure despite the rumors and tension. Her quiet determination and resilience earned her respect from many, and even those who had doubted her began to admire her strength. Years passed, and the day of graduation finally arrived. Judith stood proudly in her cap and gown, clutching her diploma with tears in her eyes. It had been a long and challenging journey, but she had made it. She thought of her grandmother in that moment and how proud she would have been. As Judith celebrated with her classmates, Raymond approached her with a smile that was both warm and nervous. In his hand was a small velvet box. "Judith," he began, his voice steady despite the crowd around them. "I've been waiting for this day not just because you've accomplished so much, but because it's the perfect moment to tell you how much you mean to me." Judith's heart raced as he dropped to one knee. "You are the most amazing woman I've ever met. Your kindness, your strength, your determination, it's everything I've ever wanted in a partner. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Judith's hands flew to her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." The crowd erupted into cheers as Raymond slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a moment of pure joy, one that Judith would cherish forever. But not everyone shared in her happiness. Flora stood at a distance, watching the scene unfold. Her chest tightened with a mix of anger and regret. She had tried so hard to destroy Judith's chances, but instead, she had only pushed her closer to Raymond. For the first time, Flora realized how much her jealousy had consumed her and how wrong she had been. A few days after the graduation ceremony, Flora knocked on Judith's door. When Judith opened it, she was surprised to see Flora standing there, looking nervous and uncertain. "Judith," Flora began, her voice soft, "I need to talk to you." Judith nodded, stepping aside to let her in. Flora took a deep breath before continuing. "I owe you an apology for everything. I was so jealous of you, of how much everyone admired you, of how Raymond cared about you, and I let it get the best of me. I said and did terrible things, and I'm sorry." Judith's eyes softened as she listened. She had never expected Flora to apologize, but hearing the sincerity in her voice, she knew it was genuine. "I forgive you, Flora," Judith said quietly. "We all make mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them." Flora nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you. I promise to do better." Later that evening, Gloria called Judith into her room. She motioned for Judith to sit beside her, her expression serious but kind. "Judith," she began, "there's something I need to tell you. I should have said it a long time ago." Judith looked at her curiously, wondering what was on her mind. "Before I brought you to Lagos, I had a dream," Gloria said. "Your grandmother appeared to me. She was begging me to bring you here, saying you were destined for something greater. At first, I didn't understand, but the dream stayed with me. I knew I had to do something." Judith's eyes filled with tears as she listened. "You mean she wanted me to be here?" Gloria nodded. "Yes, she believed in you, Judith. And now, seeing how far you've come, I know she was right. You've made us all so proud." Judith hugged her hand tightly, overwhelmed by emotion. "Thank you for everything, Aunt Gloria. I wouldn't be here without you." The wedding was a beautiful affair, filled with love and joy. Judith and Raymond exchanged vows in front of their family and friends, promising to support and cherish each other for the rest of their lives. It was a day Judith had never dreamed possible, and yet it was her reality. Flora, true to her word, had turned over a new leaf. She even found love herself, marrying a kind and understanding man who brought out the best in her. She and Judith had begun to rebuild their relationship, and the family was finally at peace. As Judith and Raymond embarked on their new life together, Judith couldn't help but reflect on her journey. She had faced so many challenges, but through it all, she had remained true to herself, surrounded by love, hope, and the promise of a brighter future. She knew that her grandmother's dream for her had come true,